So my name's Robbie Blackhall-Miles, and firstly, I'm going to talk a little bit about what fossil plants is and who I am. So I've been living and working up in North Wales on and off all my life. Since I was a teenager, I have been involved in the ex situ conservation of lots of different things, both animals and plants. Having worked for the Welsh Mountain Zoo, I was involved in the very early stages of the red squirrel conservation work that's going on in North Wales and pine marten conservation work. And my main interest in life, though, is plants. So even though I worked with animals, and specifically actually at the Welsh Mountain Zoo, I worked with birds, all the way alongside that, I've been kind of ticking along working with plants. About 10 years ago, my partner and I moved here to Llanberis, and we bought a house with a garden that had nothing but grass. We got rid of the grass, and I brought a collection of plants that I'd brought together over the course of my life here to our garden in Llanberis. But realizing that some of those plants were quite threatened in the wild, we really didn't want this collection of plants to remain of absolutely no use to the worlds of science, conservation and education. And so we joined an organisation called Botanic Gardens Conservation International. Just more recently than that, we became a accredited botanic garden. So, you know, a tiny little back garden in Llanberis is a world recognised botanic institution now, which is quite amazing. Our garden holds around about 1,100 different species of plants, and it's only 115 square metres. We also now have a conservation research nursery where we research the cultivation for conservation of threatened plant species. And a lot of the work that we do is for plant species in the Southern Hemisphere. So we have projects in Chile, Chile and South America, South Africa, so the Western Cape of South Africa, and some plant species in Australia. But also we get involved in some species from China and North America and what have you as well. I also run a horticultural consultancy practice from here in Llanberis. So that's who we are. But what is ex situ and how does it relate to plants? Well, in 1992, about 190 different countries around the world signed up to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And one of the targets of the Convention on Biological Diversity, or the CBD, is through the Global Strategy of Plant Conservation. And it's target 8, at least 75% of threatened plant species in ex situ collections by this year. And we are going to fall pretty short of that. And almost certainly we're going to fall short of that here in Wales. But basically the way that a lot of countries went about handling this target 8 of the global strategy for plant conservation is they look to seed banking, which allows plants to be stored as seed in climate controlled conditions in places like the Millennium Seed Bank. However, there's a bit more to ex situ conservation than that. So ex situ really should be there to create options for plants. It shouldn't be seen as a long-term solution. It should be seen as part of a range of different solutions for plant conservation issues. As I say, many countries use seed banking, but there's a lot of plant species out there that you can't seed bank. They're what is known as recalcitrant, and as such, they, like oak trees, they have to germinate straight away, almost as soon as they fall from the tree. But there's also things like ferns that, you know, the spore of ferns can't be stored. Bryophytes, what do you do with a bryophyte? You can't store bryophytes very easily in gene banks or seed banks. And also, if you consider fungi are virtually impossible to store for ex situ. So, you know, kind of, we should be looking to understand more about how we can preserve plants through ex situ in other ways. Ex situ for plants protects plants while we fix problems. So if we've got a habitat problem for the plants, then bringing them into ex situ gives them a safe place to be while we fix that problem. It can protect plants in the long or short term. And it also allows research. This is a plant that I work with. It's called my meaty stokaway. It's in South Africa. You are in this photograph looking at the entirety of the world population of this plant. There are 9 of them. And we've been working really hard to understand how to germinate the seeds of this plant. Unfortunately, what happened with this species is that it was held in one of the world's leading seed banks, but because they couldn't germinate the seeds, the seeds were got rid of, which was a bit of a disaster. And it's taken us quite a long time to figure out just what might need to be done with the seeds of this plant. So that's one really good reason why we need to be growing plants as well as just putting them in seed banks. It's all right me doing a whole load of work with plants all around the world, but actually we realized very quickly that we could be using some of the techniques that we can use for conserving plant species right here in Wales, with some of the very threatened species that we have right on our doorstep. Wales is really, really important for quite a lot of plants on a global scale. We have plants that occur here because they're on the northernmost edge of their range, the southernmost edge of their range, the westernmost edge of their range. Some plants are really kind of pushed to the edge because of the altitude at which they grow. So they're growing at the tops of mountains like the subarctic alpines in Snowdonia. They are on the edge of evolution. So they're things like the endemic microspecies of Sorbus here in the UK. We've got 38 endemic Sorbus species here in the UK. And, you know, they're kind of evolving very, very quickly. And it's very important that we look after those kind of evolutionary adaptations to allow them to continue to evolve into the future. We also have plants here, the archaeophytes, the plants that were brought here by people, which are right on what I would call the anthropogenic edge of their range here in Wales. So plants that have been brought maybe from the Mediterranean, or with the monks that travelled across Europe as medicines, that have remained here in Wales and now have Wales as a stronghold. But the thing about having all these plants that are right on the very edge here in Wales is that understanding what's going on with them and making sure that they're protected here in Wales can have big impacts for them right across their range, across the world. So Wales is quite important for its plant species. I'm just going to let you absorb this slide for one moment. This slide, the information in this slide comes from the Red List of Vascular Plants from 2008. And it just shows how many species here in Wales are threatened with extinction in Wales. So for us, as I say, we wanted to make sure that we looked after some of the plants that were growing on our doorstep, and that meant that we needed to kind of get involved in looking after them in their conservation. But because I've been involved in ex situ conservation for a long time, it's meant that really that's what I do best. So, you know, I started looking at what I could do to help these plants through ex situ conservation. This is one that I've been working with. This is Sorbus rvonnicola. I would say that this is on the evolutionary edge of its range. It's a obligate apomicte, which means that it reproduces by making little clones of itself through its seed. There are about 30 mature plants of this species on the Menai Strait. It's critically endangered on the world scale by increased sea level through climate change. And a couple of years ago, we brought seed of this into cultivation, working with the National Botanic Gardens of Wales, to make sure that it was safe from the erosion that's happening on the bank of the Menai Straits at its home at Nantporth Nature Reserve. We're going to be looking to put this plant into a safe space on one of the islands in the Straits, here in the Menai Straits, and also make this plant available to botanic gardens all over the country, so that no matter what happens to it in the wild, this plant's going to be looked after into the future, so that it can continue to evolve. Another plant that we've been working with more recently is part of a great big consortium of different people that includes Treborth Botanic Gardens, Conwy County Borough Council, Chester Zoo and others, is the wild catony astro on the Great Orme. This is a species that was reduced to just 6 plants in the wild at one point. I think that there's now over 40. And what we've been doing is trying to understand how we can propagate it through taking cuttings or layering more effectively, because it doesn't like to come from cuttings very easily. This is what's known as a facultative apomicte. So it can produce clones of itself through its seed, but it can also produce non-identical seeds, so not seeds that aren't clones of itself, through a kind of more standard sexual reproduction method, which means that there is a little bit of genetic diversity out there in this species. And if we want to maximize on that genetic diversity with a very small gene pool, then we need to be able to reproduce individuals of the few that are genetically different that are growing currently on the Great Orme. Another species that we've been working with, this is Cephalanthra longitholia, the sword-leaved helleborine. We have Wales's second largest population of this internationally threatened orchid species here, right on our doorstep in Llanberis, and that population contains roughly about 30 individuals. So when I say second largest, we're really not talking about a very large population at all. Unfortunately, earlier this year, 3 of those individuals were stolen from the wild here in Llanberis. But we've been working at in situ habitat management for it to make sure that the habitat here in the woodlands around Llanberis is the best it can be for this species to be able to grow. We've also been keeping an eye and monitoring, making records of these plants as they flower each year, so that we've got some data about how they're doing. And we've just reached agreement with Natural Resources Wales and Gwynedd County Council to bring 3 plants of this into cultivation at our nursery, so that we can produce seed and subsequently young plants that will be able to be put back into the wild once we get some habitat that's really good for this species to go back into. So, you know, this is a species that we're kind of working quite hard to really get going again here in Wales. It's also found at Newborough and some points on the Llyn Peninsula and a little bit further south, as you can see from the map there, although its stronghold in the UK is in Scotland. Lycopodiella inundata, the marsh club moss, is a species that we have tried with and not done so great with. So it's one that we're working on. It's one that can't really be seed banked. It's declining very rapidly here in Wales. And unfortunately, just a couple of years ago, one of its sites was really badly damaged. We stepped in to try and bring it into cultivation to kind of try and bulk up the population so that once that site was restored to how it should be, we could put plants back. Unfortunately, the cuttings that we brought into cultivation didn't do so well. So it's one that we're going to be working with to try and kind of understand a bit better how to grow it. Not very much is known about how to grow this plant species at all worldwide. And it seems that the ones from Wales are a little bit more difficult than any of the rest of its range. There are only 9 plants of Saxophogus espetosa in the wild in Cwmidwal here in Wales, and a further 18 plants in Scotland. So this is a species that is absolutely desperately threatened here in the UK. Although on a world level, it's actually quite a common species. You can see from all those little red dots on the world map there that it's found all the way across the USA and Northern Europe, and actually over into Russia and Asia as well. But here in Wales, it is threatened most certainly by climate change. It's a relic from the ice ages, and unfortunately, the rocks where it grows in Cwmidwal aren't receiving enough snow cover each winter for this plant to remain safe from the winter wet. I think is the real reason why it's declining. But by having plants in cultivation, we create options for this species, and we are able to produce plants that at some point, maybe in the future, we will be able to put back into the wild. Maybe moving them higher up into the Cwm or even into suitable locations elsewhere in Snowdonia. Who knows? That's me on my hands and knees, which is the way that you usually see me if you see me out in the wild here in Wales. Looking for a plant called Juncus capitatus. Unfortunately, we didn't find it. Its localities in the UK are down in Cornwall, and also just a few sites on Anglesey. This is me at Cwmran, near RAF Valley, and we have brought soil samples into cultivation to see if we can get any remnant seed bank that there might be in the soil samples to germinate, so that we can have a pretty steady production of seed of this species. Natural Resources Wales, through their Dynamic Dunes project, is looking to do some restoration work at Cwmran, which hopefully will restore some suitable areas for this little plant, Juncus capitatus, to grow. And if we haven't got some seed of it for it to be able to grow there again, then we're reliant upon what seed there might be in the seed bank there at Cwmran. So this is a project to watch. I hope that we get some germination this autumn. I keep getting excited seeing seedlings coming up, but they all seem to turn out to be other species of rush at the moment, which is a bit annoying. Another one that we're working with, Loronium natans, has a stronghold in Europe here in Wales. We have a really important population of it in Llyn, just 50 metres from our house. And whilst we don't really intend on restoring this plant back to the wild, there's no real need for us to be able to have to do that. What we do use these plants that we have in cultivation for is education. This is a species that is really difficult to show people in its wild state unless you can drag them out into the water. So by turning up at sporting events and what have you here in Llanberis, we have quite a few, the Snowdon Race and what have you, with buckets with this growing in them, we can show people this really, really important plant that is one of the designated features of the triple SI of Llyn and other upland lakes here in Wales. So, you know, that's a really good, another really good reason for having plants ex situ. And we work for science. So this is one that most people would think, well, why do we need to conserve that? Well, that's the lady in the picture is a lady called Rosie. She's not reading the newspaper. She's actually making herbarium specimens of Saxophagus hypnoides in Cormidwell. And whilst Saxophagus espetosa, the tufted saxifrage, is found all over the Northern Hemisphere, Saxophagus hypnoides has most of its population here in the UK. And here in Wales, our plants are cytologically different. So that means they have a different number of chromosomes to the plants that are found elsewhere in the world, and that's including the plants elsewhere in the UK, which means that our plants of Saxophagus hypnoides are really quite important. What we did with Rosie was we looked at the genetic differences that have occurred in this plant over time. So by looking at herbarium specimens from 200 years ago, we were able to understand what the genetic diversity in the populations is. And what we found was that there is very little genetic diversity in each of the populations here in North Wales. And one of the outcomes of that project was an understanding that if we want to make sure that these plants are resilient for the future, then we need to probably find a way of ensuring that some of that genetic diversity moves around and that there's a flow of genetic material between the individual populations here in Wales. And this is our newest project. Just this year we were able to collect plants of Allium ampliprasum var ampliprasum from South Stack on Anglesey. It's only found in a small population in Cornwall and down in the Bristol Channel on Flatholme and Steepholme Islands, and in one population that contains between 40 and 80 individuals on South Stack in Anglesey. This is a really probably culturally important plant here in Wales and was probably brought here from the Eastern Mediterranean by Phoenician traders back in the Bronze Age. We are currently working with the Anglesey Local Nature Partnership to find suitable restoration sites for this species on Anglesey, because this species is currently threatened by road verge mowing, by flower picking, but also by a big electric power project that's currently being looked at on Anglesey. So by finding alternative places where this species can grow, we can make sure that it is looked after for the people of Wales for the future. And really just the final points in this, I do all of this stuff and a lot of people ask me who pays for it, where does the money for it come from? Well, I work as a horticultural consultant. I do it out of love, and I really, up until now, have just put my own hand in my own pocket to get it done. And that is the case for a lot of these projects that go on across the UK and the world. When you're into conservation, you do a lot out of passion. And for me, getting on and just doing this work is very important. Some of these projects can cost as much as nearly £1,800 in their first year. But, you know, for me, I just think it's the most important thing that I can be doing for the plants here in Wales. How you can help, though, is by providing accurate records. I can't make these kind of interventions without understanding where the plants are and whether they need some help from us. So supplying records to Cofnod or the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, or even to apps like iNaturalist, allows me to understand exactly what's going on with the plants out there here on our doorstep, and to be able to understand if any of them need help. And of course, finally, I can't do any of it without the help of my friends. So all of these organisations are involved with me somewhere along the line, helping me to conserve North Wales's plants, or me helping them to conserve North Wales's plants. So a huge thank you to all of them.